She set it beside the creek on the first morning the cold turned the grass silver. Frost stitched the fence rails white, and the water moved dark under a thin skin of ice. Clara Whitcomb held the ledger against her chest as if figures weighed more than oak. On the other side of the boundary, Eli Mercer rested both hands on the top rail and waited with the patience of a man who understood that some sentences cost more to say than others. Clara looked at the line of black ink she had added 3 times before believing it, then at the house with the east-facing window bright behind him, and finally at Eli. Her voice did not shake. "My late husband left only debts." Eli glanced once toward the pasture, once toward the house, and back to her face. "Then let me be your first prophet." It was a strange line, nearly light, and that was why it carried such weight. Some people arrive in your life as weather. Some arrive as repair. For months earlier, in June of 1889, Clara Whitcomb was 31 years old, widowed 14 months, and trying to keep 46 acres south of Durango alive on less money than honesty required. The place sat off the Florida road where the ground sloped toward the Animas and, in a generous year, held 11 milk cows, 2 broodmares, 36 hens, a kitchen garden, and an orchard still pretending to be prosperous. Her husband Jonas had died in April of 1888 after riding home through sleet from the San Juan foothills and taking fever 3 days later. He had been 36, charming when money came in, careless when it did not, and poor at the kind of arithmetic winter eventually enforces. What he left behind was a smokehouse roof beginning to give, a north fence sagging toward the wash, a cream account behind at Pike Mercantile, doctor bills, seed bills, county taxes, and a mortgage note held by Silas Bender at 8%. When Clara forced herself to total every line, the debt stood at $842.60. Debt counts a household more coldly than grief ever can. The house still held Jonas in untidy pieces. His boots remained by the back door because moving them felt too much like announcing a finality Clara already lived with. His coat hung on the pantry peg. Clara shared the place with her 7-year-old son, Thomas, who had quick questions and a child's solemn belief that adults could fix whatever they named aloud, and with Jonas's mother, Lenore Whitcomb, 62, silver-haired, stiff in the hands when rain was coming, and devoted to the frontier religion of thrift, prayer, and not discussing sorrow before chores. Clara rose at 4:30, lit the stove, milked before dawn, skimmed cream by 6, sent Thomas to Ruth Bell's schoolhouse by 8, and spent the day carrying water, patching clothes, salting butter, bargaining with weather, and pretending delay was a kind of strategy. She did not cry often. She had no time set aside for collapse. Grief does not leave. It only learns the rooms. There had once been a ritual to Tuesdays. Owen Pike drove out from Durango in his spring wagon to collect cream and eggs for Pike Mercantile, to bring Thomas peppermint if business had been kind, and to stand on Clara's porch in a respectable coat with the expression of a man who hoped usefulness might someday be mistaken for fate. Owen was 38, widowed 3 years, careful with money, generous in public, and the sort of man a town preferred because no one had to explain him twice. By June, Clara could feel the county beginning to arrange her future in his direction. Marta Peabody at the post office said a woman should not have to carry a whole place alone. Ruth Bell smiled too carefully whenever Tuesday came up. Mateo Salazar, the farrier, observed that steady money was not a romantic quality, but it was one a roof appreciated. They called it concern, not pressure. It was still pressure. The town chorus had formed without asking Clara whether she wanted music. The week everything changed. Tuesday did not announce itself. Thursday did. Clara heard wagon wheels before breakfast and stepped onto the porch with her apron still untied. A team came through the gate carrying pine boards, a sack of nails, a coil of wire, and a battered tool chest. Eli Mercer climbed down from the wagon before she could decide whether surprise or alarm ought to come first. Clara knew him by sight from church suppers and town errands. He was 34, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, quiet in the specific way of men who listen before deciding whether speaking is necessary. He rented a room behind Mateo Salazar's forge, built sheds and chicken runs for ranchers who could not spare their own hands, and had the local reputation of doing hard things without pausing to narrate himself. Clara did not know why he was in her yard. She learned before he had both boots on the ground. One of the south pasture calves had gone through the wash where spring runoff had undermined the fence, and the rest of the heifers were already bunching toward the gap with that blind collective confidence cattle reserve for trouble. Thomas came around the corner shouting. Lenore appeared in the kitchen doorway with flour on her hands. Clara ran. By the time she reached the wash, Eli was already down in it, one shoulder braced against the broken panel while mud slid under his boots. He did not waste time on introductions. He handed Clara the wire, told Thomas to rattle a feed bucket, shouted for Lenore to open the far gate, and held the whole ugly thing together long enough for Clara to twist a temporary brace into place. The cattle turned. The gap held. 15 muddy minutes later, the field settled back into its ordinary chewing silence. Eli climbed out of the wash with clay on one cheek and wet cuffs dark to the elbow, as if emergencies had always expected him. Some men introduced themselves with names. Better men introduced themselves with usefulness. Only then did he explain why he had come. The afternoon before, he had been at Silas Bender's office entering figures while Bender's regular clerk was away in Cortez. Clara's note had been open on the desk. Bender, in the same mild tone he used for church donations and foreclosure, had said that if Mrs. Whitcomb could not make a $150 reduction by September 1st, the West 12 acres would be the fair place to begin separation. Best interest all around. Eli had asked questions because some men mistake a quiet voice for a harmless one. By the end of the conversation he knew Clara had been given less warning than the situation deserved. So he had loaded lumber, wire, and tools at first light and driven out intending to repair a fence before delivering bad news. Clara, soaked at the hem and cut across both palms by wire, stared at him and heard herself say the simplest truth she owned. My late husband left only debts. Eli wiped mud from his cheek with the back of his wrist. Then let me be your first prophet, he said. It was too odd a line to be pity. That was why she remembered it. He came back the next day to reset the south fence properly, and the day after that because the smokehouse roof had begun admitting more weather than confidence. Clara did not have cash enough to hire him in any comfortable way, so he proposed terms the way practical men build a bridge. Exact, modest, and meant to carry weight. He would take part payment in eggs, cream, and whatever small amounts of cash she could spare, and in return he would show her where labor could save what money could not. By the end of that first week Eli had set 3 new cedar posts in the wash, straightened the smokehouse door, found $6.40 in monthly feed waste, and pointed out that the cream shed floor would rot through if it were not braced before autumn damp took hold. Clara watched him move through the property as if wood grain and weather were a language he had practiced for years. Work is one way to learn a person. Quiet work is the surest way. Summer settled over La Plata County with its long deceptive light. The cottonwoods thickened. The San Juans stood blue and distant at dawn and close enough to touch at sunset. Clara's life acquired a second ritual beside the old Tuesday one. Eli began arriving every Thursday at first light with his ledger wrapped in oilcloth and his tools sorted so neatly that the arrangement itself looked respectful. Some weeks he stayed until noon, some until supper, depending on what the place admitted it needed. He rebuilt the chicken run in a way that kept foxes honest. He tightened the front gate latch so Thomas no longer had to hang from it with both feet off the ground. He laid a shallow drainage line that sent storm water around the kitchen foundation instead of under it. Clara paid him in ham, eggs packed in straw, cream set aside before Pike's wagon arrived, and one $10 bill from the sale of a colt she had hoped to keep another year. Eli entered every item in the ledger and never rounded in his own favor. Numbers under the right hands can become a kind of mercy. The town noticed because towns always notice anything that happens patiently enough. Marta Peabody asked whether Mr. Mercer charged extra for pretending not to court a widow. Mateo Salazar said Eli had started refusing better-paying jobs on Thursdays, which was either foolishness or intention. Ruth Bell told Thomas, in Clara's hearing and with schoolteacher innocence that convinced no one, that children wrote better composition when they felt secure at home. Owen Pike noticed most of all. On the next proper Tuesday, he stood on Clara's porch beside the cream cans and looked past her shoulder toward the rebuilt chicken run. He did not let irritation show. He only remarked that Mr. Mercer seemed industrious. Clara replied that industry was in short supply and therefore welcome. Owen nodded and said Pike Mercantile would be willing to restructure some of the account if Clara wished to simplify matters. Simplify was a clean word for a messy proposal. Clara heard it for what it was. Good people are still capable of arriving at the wrong conclusion. By mid-July, Eli had become part of the place in a way that made his absence visible. One Thursday he did not come because a storm had torn half a shed off the McReady place north of town, and Clara caught herself looking up each time wheels sounded on the road. The next day he arrived before sunrise with a bundle of salvaged glass panes bought cheaply from a hotel renovation in town. The kitchen's north window leaked light and heat in equal measure, he said. The east wall beside the table had room for a better one if she wanted it. Clara answered that she did not have the money for a better one. Eli said he had not asked about money. He had asked about light. He spent the day opening the wall, framing the space, setting the panes, trimming the edges clean, and fitting the sash so tightly that the next morning the rising sun spilled across Clara's table in one warm sheet. Thomas sat in it with his spelling cards as though the room itself had grown kinder overnight. Later Clara found Eli near the barn sharpening a draw knife and asked why east. He shrugged, as if the answer belonged to common sense. So you'd have good light when the day is still honest, he said. Some promises do not announce themselves. They simply face east. By late July, even Lenore had begun speaking of Eli without using his surname, which in a frontier household amounted to quiet adoption. Thomas followed him whenever he was allowed and learned the names of tools faster than he learned scripture. Clara herself developed a more dangerous habit. She started hearing what Eli chose not to say. He never asked how Jonas had accumulated so much debt. He never told her what to sell, only what the figures required. On the evenings when some date, object, or smell brought Jonas back too sharply, Eli, if he was still mending something by the shed, let the silence remain whole instead of filling it with advice. Once he found Clara holding her mother's old recipe box in the smokehouse. The lid cracked where Thomas had dropped it years before. He asked for the box, carried it to the porch, and repaired the split with glue, 2 tiny brass pins, and a patience so careful Clara had to turn away under the pretense of fetching twine. Memory, if it is handled gently, becomes something a person can bear to keep touching. August brought the county fair to Durango, and with it the social machinery Clara had hoped to avoid. Owen bought Thomas lemonade and stood with Clara under the awning by the poultry shed. He said he hoped she understood his visits had never been merely commercial. He could clear the Pike account, speak to Bender, give Thomas a reliable future and Lenore a house in town when winters grew harder. He spoke as one would negotiate a lease, respectfully, precisely, careful not to offend while laying out advantages. Before Clara could answer, Eli appeared carrying a basket of peaches Mateo's sister had sent for Lenore. He had come in with a wagon load of repaired harness and happened to be passing. Happened to be passing was the sort of lie decent men told when dignity mattered. Owen tipped his hat. Eli returned the gesture. The air between them remained perfectly civil and deeply occupied. A rival need not sneer to be real. The rest of August compressed itself into work and watchfulness. Clara and Eli turned the neglected west strip into something that might actually earn by autumn. He measured rows while she chose seed for late turnips and cabbage. They counted jars in the cellar, calculated butter yield, and discovered that dried apples brought nearly 12 cents more a pound than bruised fruit sold quickly to the mercantile. He repaired the handcart so Thomas could haul wood without tipping half the load. He built shelves in the cream shed smooth enough to clean properly because, as he put it, dirt steals profit one unnoticed handful at a time. One afternoon he spent 3 hours in the irrigation ditch clearing willow roots while cold water pushed at his knees and the sun burned the back of his neck. Another evening he repaired the pantry latch and sharpened every kitchen knife before he left because Clara had once mentioned that dull blades made her hand ache. None of it looked like courtship from the road. That was precisely why it felt more serious than flowers or speeches. Love, before it speaks, usually picks up a hammer. September approached with the menace of a date already written down. Silas Bender came out on the second Monday of the month in a black coat too heavy for the weather and sat in Clara's kitchen under the east window, complimenting the workmanship before he began discussing the land he expected might soon change hands. Bender was 47, church-going, smooth-spoken, and so committed to reasonableness that he had turned it into a weapon. $150 by September 1st had been the mark for good faith, he reminded her, and while that date had passed, there remained room for orderly arrangements if principal reduction could continue through autumn. The west 12 acres adjoining Lightner Creek would be the fair place to separate if it became necessary. Best interest all around. Clara asked whether opportunity always arrived more fully informed on one side of the table than the other. Bender's smile barely shifted. In the next room, Eli, fitting a latch to the pantry door, stopped tapping entirely. Fairness is often just pressure with better tailoring. Clara sold one broodmare sooner than she wanted and hated the bargain all week. She let Pike take 2 extra cream cans at a price that annoyed Eli. Lenore tried to press $32 of burial savings into Clara's hand until Clara refused so sharply they both went quiet. Thomas offered, with a child's terrible sincerity, to sell his marbles in town. Meanwhile, Eli worked more, not less. He rebuilt the wagon tongue before it failed under a load. He patched the barn loft against weather. He spent one full Saturday shoulder-deep in mud clearing the irrigation line so the late vegetables would not dry in sight of harvest. Clara carried him water and stood watching longer than necessary while he levered roots free and tossed them onto the bank one dripping handful at a time. In that moment Clara understood there was a difference between gratitude and desire, and that the second had been quietly hiding inside the first for weeks. Want, once named, becomes harder to command. The confession she had been waiting for without knowing it came a week later by the orchard fence at dusk. September light had gone amber and thin, turning the stubble field beyond the rails the color of old coins. Clara asked him, because the question had grown too large to carry politely, why a man with better-paying jobs and no legal duty kept spending his Thursdays and Saturdays trying to rescue a place that had once belonged to another woman's husband. Eli rested both hands on the top rail and looked toward the mountains before answering. In Pueblo, he said, there had been a woman named Anna Greer. He was meant to marry her in the spring of 1884. She died in February of pneumonia after nursing a younger brother through scarlet fever. Her family left for Kansas by summer. Eli came west because every street in Pueblo sounded like an unfinished sentence. Since then he had built barns, porches, sheds, and schoolhouse roofs from Walsenburg to Mancos. He had learned how to be useful in 6 counties and at home in none. I got used to helping places I would not stay in, he said. Then one day I looked up and realized I had stayed here anyway. Some truths arrive with less noise than a gate latch. The next morning Clara found, propped against the porch, a cedar frame Eli had built in the night. Inside, under clean glass, lay the Whitcomb land map, flattened and marked in his careful hand with revised yield notes, feed cuts, projected cream totals, and a margin estimate showing that if the dried apples sold well and butter held steady, she could make the next payment with a little left over. He had written only one line in the bottom corner. Figures look kinder when they are told the truth. Clara carried the map to the kitchen table and cried for exactly 3 minutes in the east light where no one but the window could see her. Relief is still a burden when a person has carried fear too long. She made the first real reduction on August 31st, one day before Bender's deadline had originally closed. $150 in mixed bills and coin, laid on the mercantile counter while Bender's clerk watched and Owen Pike stood by the lamp shelves pretending not to hear the count. Bender accepted the money with satisfaction so polished it almost looked benevolent. He remarked that he was pleased Mrs. Whitcomb had accepted sensible guidance. Clara asked whose guidance he meant. Bender glanced, almost kindly, toward Owen. It was the first moment she understood how neatly the town had arranged her future without asking whether she wished to inhabit it. Bender expected security. Owen expected time. Marta expected gratitude. Even Lenore expected survival to choose louder than love. Clara left with the receipt in her pocket and a bitter taste she could not quite name. Outside, Eli waited by the hitch rail with 2 sacks of salt and an expression that asked nothing. She only said, "I paid it." He nodded once, handed her the lighter sack for the ride, and climbed into the wagon without demanding praise. Care is often easiest to trust when it does not insist on witness. Autumn sharpened the whole country. By the third week of September, the cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold. Mornings came with frost stitched to the fence line, and steam rose from the stock tank at daybreak. Clara and Eli fell into a pattern both steadier and more dangerous because it felt sustainable. He no longer knocked before entering the yard. Thomas began saving questions for Thursdays. Lenore set out an extra plate without asking. Owen Pike, to his credit, did not sulk. He simply became more explicit. On the first Tuesday in October, he told Clara that after harvest supper, he meant to ask whether she would consider a formal courtship before winter closed the roads. He said it plainly and with visible effort. Because sincerity deserves respect even when it is unwelcome, Clara thanked him before admitting she could not promise what answer would come. Owen accepted that with a nod, though his jaw tightened once before he left. Rejection is easier to admire in theory than to carry home in a body. 2 days later, the north wind tore loose shingles from the cream shed and dropped a dead branch across the paddock gate. Eli spent half the afternoon on the roof in weather no sensible man would volunteer for, then came down soaked through and shivering as dusk turned the yard blue. Clara made him sit by the stove while she poured coffee, and Lenore forced dry socks on him with the authority of a woman who had already decided what place he occupied in the house. Thomas fell asleep against Eli's arm before the coffee cooled. Clara stood at the stove and watched the boy there, safe and perfectly unembarrassed in his trust, and felt something settle inside her that had been shifting since June. It was not gratitude this time, and not even desire. It was recognition. A home is not the walls. It is the person whose wet coat gets hung by your stove without discussion. Stillness can be louder than a vow. Harvest supper at the church hall came on October 12th under lanterns and a moon bright enough to silver the wagon ruts. Clara wore a dark blue wool dress with a high collar and long sleeves. Eli stood near the back wall in a clean white shirt and dark vest, looking like a man who would rather have framed the hall than occupied it. Owen found Clara before the hymn books were stacked away and asked, with admirable composure, whether she would walk outside. He led her to the church pasture where the boundary fence ran down toward the creek. Lantern light reached only part of the field. The rest belonged to moonlight and cold grass. At the fence, Owen told her he knew enough to see that a Thursday had become more important than a Tuesday. He said he did not blame her for wanting a man with stronger hands than his own, but there were other kinds of strength. He could clear the remaining Pike account by winter, provide proper schooling for Thomas in town, and keep Lenore warm when her joints grew worse. He would not ask for quick affection. He would build it carefully if she let him. Clara listened because he had earned that courtesy. Then she told him that kindness without belovedness still felt like a bargain, and she had done enough bargaining for one lifetime. Owen looked down at the rail a long while. When he finally spoke, there was real hurt in it, and therefore real friction. "You may find affection does not settle a mortgage," he said. The line was not cruel. It was wounded. That made it land. They were not alone. Clara heard the step in the grass before she saw Eli coming down from the churchyard shadows, hat in hand as if he had been trying, unsuccessfully, to grant privacy. Owen turned toward him with the exhausted fairness of a man who had reached the end of a contest he never wanted to fight dishonorably. "Then say your piece, Mercer," he said. "I'm tired of being the only man here willing to speak aloud." The creek sounded below them. Eli did not look at Owen first. He looked at Clara, and in that glance she saw the summer collected. The wash fence, the east window, the map, the shelves, the repaired box, the ditch, the roof, the patient ledger. "You told me your late husband left only debts," he said. He stepped to the fence line and laid one hand on the top rail as if honoring the exact place where two futures met. "Then let me be your first prophet." He spoke on before fear could reclaim him. Not because he wanted her land or her gratitude. Because he had spent half a year building things on that place and discovered he had been building his way toward her. Because Thomas looked for him when he was late. Because Lenore set a plate for him as if hope had already moved in. Because he was tired of being useful in places that never became home. The boundary held. So did Clara, just barely. For one moment nobody moved. Then Owen gave the contest its last necessary weight. "If you fail her," he said to Eli, "I will not forgive it simply because you meant well. Eli answered at once. Neither will I. That was the line on which the matter truly turned. Owen stood very still, then put his hat on with careful hands. I hope, for all our sakes, that affection proves better at arithmetic than I think it does, he said. There was dignity in the sentence and cost under it. To Clara he added, with a sad half-smile that made her like him more in defeat, that the cream price would remain unchanged through November. He walked back toward the hall alone. There was no triumph in watching him go. Only the solemn relief of a wrong answer finally dismissed. Not every rival loses by becoming small. Some simply lose honestly. Clara did not cross the fence immediately. People who have been practical too long do not run toward happiness without first checking whether it is likely to vanish when touched. Eli waited where he was. He did not repeat himself. He did not come around the rail to make the choice easier by force. At last Clara laughed once, softly. You are a terrible bookkeeper if you think I'm the only one being asked to risk something here, she said. Eli's mouth moved at one corner. I know the numbers. Then she answered him as she had by the wash, but now without defense. My late husband left only debts. He met the line the way he always had, steady and unembarrassed. Then let me be your first prophet. Clara crossed at the gate 2 posts down because some thresholds deserve to be walked properly. When she reached him, she laid both hands flat against his coat and rested her forehead once against his chest as if listening for whether peace had an actual sound. It did. It sounded like a heart that did not hurry her. The public test came inside the church hall 10 minutes later. Marta Peabody nearly dropped a serving spoon. Ruth Bell looked openly delighted. Lenore closed her eyes for one grateful second. Owen Pike, already gathered back into himself enough to qualify as heroic in a small town, crossed the room to Silas Bender, who had arrived late in his town coat, and said something too low for Clara to hear. Bender's gaze moved from Clara to Eli to the room that had plainly chosen its side. He approached with the smooth expression of a man revising strategy in public. Mrs. Whitcomb, he said, he trusted the payment schedule remained understood. Before Clara could answer, Lenore rose from her chair by the stove with a force no one had seen in years. Understood by us, perhaps not by you, she said. Thomas, sensing battle and emboldened by adults, announced to the whole room that Mr. Mercer fixed things better than any bank ever had. Laughter moved through the hall, warm and not entirely gentle. Social judgment rarely needs shouting. It only needs witnesses. There was one final practical contest to settle, and Clara settled it 5 days later at the creek where early winter had already started silvering the banks. She walked the west strip with Bender and Eli while survey stakes marked the ground Bender had once assumed would be his. Clara carried the revised ledger and the framed map. Eli carried nothing but his hammer because he said tools belonged on a man even when numbers did the speaking. Clara laid out the dried apple receipts, butter tallies, reduced loss estimates, and projected turnip sale to the army buyer in town. If weather held and cattle stayed sound, she could meet the October interest and make principal reduction before Christmas. Bender listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked across the squared shed roofs, the repaired fence line, the east window bright on the house, and admitted, with more human friction than she had expected, that he had already arranged grazing expansion assuming this strip would open. Reversing it would cost him. It would cost me more to lose it, Clara said. Bender removed his gloves finger by finger and nodded. Very well. I misjudged which assets on this place were active. He left with dignity, which was the most mercy the story owed him. A field keeps the name of whoever fights for it longest. By the end of October, true cold had arrived. Thomas had begun calling for Eli before the wagon fully stopped, as if the man had become another season that returned reliably. Clara and Eli were married on October 28th at Father Lucero's small chapel in Durango, with Lenore crying discreetly into a handkerchief she later denied using. Marta Peabody in triumphant plum silk, Ruth Bell smiling without disguise, Mateo Salazar standing witness, and Owen Pike seated in the second row because honorable men sometimes remain honorable at personal cost. There was no grand honeymoon because cattle and weather do not honor romance. There was only supper at the Whitcomb house, fresh bread in the east light the next morning, and the practical miracle of finding another person's boots by the back door without feeling intruded upon. Eli moved into the wardrobe one shelf at a time. Clara touched his sleeve and told him there was room. Grief did not object. It simply made space. Love does not replace loss. It learns to live beside it without flinching. On the first morning of November, Clara carried the ledger to the creek because private reckoning had become almost ceremonial. Frost stitched the rails white. Steam lifted from the pasture where the cattle moved. Eli had just finished setting a new post where spring runoff would test the line again in March. Clara opened the ledger to the page they had both avoided celebrating too soon. Feet stuffings, dried apples, butter, turnips, repair reductions, cream stabilization. There it was at last. A month closed in black ink, $23.14 after obligations. Profit. Not enough to make poets careless, but enough to make practical people reverent. Clara looked at the number, then at Eli and said it one last time, softer now and with no bitterness in it. My late husband left only debts. Eli leaned on the hammer handle and waited because he knew some lines deserved to be completed by the person who has helped earn them. Then he answered as he had beside the wash and at the church fence. Then let me be your first prophet. This time the words were not a joke, not an offer, not even a declaration. They were simply the name of what had already happened. The winter that followed proved ordinary in the best possible ways. Snow closed the road to Durango twice and opened it again. Thomas learned long division badly but enthusiastically. Lenore's hands hurt less when the patched flue kept the kitchen warm. The smokehouse roof held. The recipe box remained mended on its shelf. The east window gathered pale sun over breakfast. At Christmas, Clara found a small cedar cradle tucked in the barn loft. Not for a child yet and not necessarily ever, but built by Eli with the same exacting workmanship he gave to anything he hoped might one day be needed. She stood with her hand on the rail a long time before calling him in to see that she had found it. He looked embarrassed and honest at once. She did not tease him. Some hopes are holier when handled gently. By April of 1890 the cottonwoods had leafed again. The creek had risen with meltwater, and the place looked less like survival and more like a future. Clara walked the property one evening while Thomas chased hens and Lenore shelled peas on the porch. Eli was in the orchard resetting two markers winter frost had shifted. The house behind him held its own shape now. Square roofline, mended gate, honest books, good light. The land had not turned easy. Calves still got sick. Prices still moved. Work still arrived every morning as if summoned. But the work no longer felt like punishment, felt shared. Clara stopped at the fence where the autumn choice had been made and rested her hand on the top rail, smiling at the memory of how impossible happiness had once sounded in that same strip of grass. There are people who think love begins with being understood. Sometimes it begins earlier, with being helped in the exact place where you were failing and not being made small for it. If the story offers anything worth carrying, perhaps it is this. Quiet worth has a way of being seen eventually, though often not by the people who first overlooked it. Grand gestures are memorable. Daily faithfulness is what changes a life. A man who fixes a roof, tells the truth about a ledger, and waits at a fence line without forcing the gate may not look like a miracle from the road. But from inside the house, he very often is. Thank you for spending this time in Clara and Eli's world. Until next time, keep riding. And if you think a woman's hardest season ends when the debt is paid, wait until you hear about the widowed schoolteacher who found a stranger sleeping in her barn beside a letter he was too ashamed to deliver. Script word count, 5891.